Welcome to workshop number 1 and episode number 5. We're going to talk about the unique learned skill of discipline of thought work. We have to know these things. I want to remind you that I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, so none of this is a medical prescription. This is an idea for you to use in your recovery. I love this picture of the neuron image here of the network of neurons working in the brain. And we become stuck in ruts due to our brain's habitual electrical patterns. This is the true thing. Past experience shapes present and future behavior. So, faced with new situations, our brains will apply rules based on prior events to match the current context. And there is a part of the brain that is especially wired to do that. It's called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Part of the prefrontal cortex, we're familiar with that if we're familiar with addiction or repetitive thought patterns. So we think of it as the brain's pattern seeker. This brain region works hard to find old rules that can be applied to the here and now to circumvent the chore of new learning. This is fascinating because sometimes we feel like we just can't make our brain do something different. And in reality, we can. But we are going to argue here for a minute about this pattern seeking part of our brain that wants to use old pathways. And it's a physical developmental thing that happens in the brain as we are thinking. Well, we're going to go against that on some of these thoughts that come into our mind and bodies and give us trouble. That's from the Harvard Health blog. It's called Can You Rewire Your Brain to Get Out of Ruts? And the answer is yes, you can. It's by this Dr. Pillay, Pillay. And you can Google him and see that. It's kind of a fun thing to look at. So let's move on. We need to see the rest of this presentation. You've seen this before, and it is important for us to just review it for a second. And remember that there are several types of rabbit holes depending on which negative thought pattern we have built. For instance, the stress-fed rabbit hole is at the end of the thought pattern built or carved into our brains by rehearsing the same fear-driven thoughts. We are familiar with these thought patterns. In fact, after some time, from a few months to a few years, we will have carved what science is now identifying as thought worms or neurodopamine ruts. These are synaptic stress hormone transmitter pathways, which without the tools of serious thought work will become the repetitive path to an emotion-driven rabbit hole called anxiety, for instance. This usually ends in a terrifying anxiety attack, leaving us in a dark rabbit hole of anxiety for several days or even months, and requiring much effort and further stress to climb back out. Time takes its toll on our resilience or our ability to recover. Next time, it will take longer and more work to climb out. So we are going to not want this one. And we don't want this trek down this old path. So now we're going to start the work of thought work. So the work of it, once the negative feeling or triggered memory formulates into a thought, the work begins. So we're going to practice thought awareness. In other words, we have to be aware of what we are thinking about. That means we walk around not in a daze or daydreaming. We are actively engaged with ourselves, our brains, and our bodies. And when we do this, we have more ability to actually identify negative or positive feelings within our bodies. And this is absolutely vital. Become a thought watcher. Pay attention, be alert to any negative thoughts. They are very sneaky, and the dark side loves to try to creep in unnoticed, and we're not going to permit that. Right. There's three R's in this. There's recognize, reject, and replace. And it is a mental behavioral adapting pattern that we're going to adopt. And we're going to recognize at the top of the thought. Remember, at the top of the thought is where we have the chance to dismantle the brain's usual pathway with that thought. And if we can catch the thought at the top of the thought and recognize the negativity by the feelings it brings, identify it as a negative trigger that we do not want. And we do that immediately within the millisecond that it is attacking our cells and our bodies. So after we have recognized the thought that we want to change by the feeling that it brings to our bodies, and we're familiar with those feelings. And so when we recognize them, now we have done the first thing to have power over them. So we reject the thought now. We're going to shortcut the thought with a physical response as a rejection of that thought. And I'm just going to read this slide. So when you take a screenshot of it or you rewatch these slides, then you're going to become very familiar with this process. This is highly effective in the retraining of the thinking mind. There is power in this physical response that we're asking our brains to do. Use a physical response in rejection of the trigger and the feelings that follow. Snap your fingers, stomp your foot, tap your thigh. If you're sitting down, stand up. If you're standing up, sit down. Do something that startles the brain, and you have to do it quickly and meaningfully. This disrupts the flow of the thought toward the rabbit hole. If we don't do these things, if you're not willing to do these physical things, then don't do any of it because it literally will not work. This is a physical work that we have to do with our bodies and our minds in order to facilitate the use of light in our bodies. We cannot just ease through life thinking that somebody's going to do our thinking for us or that some miracle is going to happen and all of a sudden our brain is going to change. And now, then, at the same time, we're going to use a verbal command to reject the swelling feeling because these thoughts don't give up easily. So say it out loud. Doubt not, fear not, or I reject that feeling, or I'm the guardian of my soul. It doesn't matter what you say, it is that you say something you believe. And when you do that, you're embedding belief into the effort. And it is fantastically effective. So just understand we have a physical response by snapping our fingers. That muscle brain connection is vital for this work. And then the command, because words have power in the universe and in our lives and in our brains and in our cells. And so we are going to use both of those wonderful avenues to shock the brain into saying, wait, what? I can't go down that old path anymore? And the answer is no, you can't. Brain, you have to do something different. All right, now we're going to replace the negative thought. We're going to consciously choose the faith filter. If you can remember the diagram that I had you take a screenshot of in the beginning here, a few slides back in the other presentation, it's important that we remember that that is a real place, that light filter is just as real as the rabbit hole is. We're not choosing the rabbit hole, we're choosing the faith or the light filter. We're going to use it right now in our minds, and we're not going to allow that brain to take an old familiar path. So we are going to form a sentence that promotes light. In other words, we're replacing the negative thought with a new thought, a different thought. So we form a sentence of your choice. Some people use the same little words for their initial replacement. And that is fine, whatever works. You can say, I love Jesus, or I am safe, and memorize several of them so you have it with confidence in your mind and your body that you're going to improve your light situation in your brain and cells. And then you speak up. We speak up and say it firmly with the passion of love behind it, because that's what we have to replace the negative with. It really comes down to replacing the negative in our minds, and it's a very real negative power, with the power of light. The other part of the replacing is that now that we have given it a very quick command in the light choice filter, we now have to do something deeper. Now we're going to speak a sentence that really is the opposite of the negative. In other words, you can see on the screen it says, I reject dark and depressive thoughts. I am safe. I will seek light. I can breathe slower. Christ walks with me. I'm safe right now. Or I decide my level of light. I reject that dark thought. I will protect my mind. Take control of your thought patterns and use the full response that you would like to be in your faith filtered area. So your thought is following that exact path. And when you have other negative thoughts of the same realm, you can use this work with and say the same things if you want, or you can say new things. All we're doing here is disallowing that negative thought from having control in our bodies and cells. When we do this, we're obeying the laws of creation. We need to understand that. And I'm going to quote our Christian paradigm here a little bit. So we speak our new sentence verbally out loud because words have physical and spiritual power. This is absolutely vital. I find it so encouraging and so strengthening, and I still use this as the dark side tries to stop us from anything good that we're doing. And I'm going to quote Paul here. Now, our Christian paradigm helps us because if we're at all a student of the New Testament, we know that Paul's story and experiences always focuses on the duality of life's experiences. He went through things, and the scriptures describe his transformation and his blessing with light coming into his life. And that is remarkable. We don't often get angels on a road, but we do get impressions and we do get understandings. And Paul gives us a little information here about how words affect our bodies. And so this is in Ephesians 4:14 through 16 and verse 29. And I'm going to read this. That we henceforth be no more children tossed to and fro and carried about with every wind of doctrine, by the sleight of men and the cunning craftiness whereby they lie in wait to deceive. but speaking the truth in love, may grow up into him in all things, which is the head, even Christ, from whom the whole body, fitly joined together and compacted by that which every joint supplieth, according to the effectual working in the measure of every part, maketh increase of the body unto the edifying of itself in love. Now, Paul always has a dual meaning in so much of what his story and writings are. Profoundly, he uses this these kinds of explanations as trying to bring the body of Christ's church together and joined in oneness. But if we want and watch for this, we will see that that language is also the same language described in the process of changing and repenting in the individual person. And all of us that have suffered in mortality can relate to Paul's teachings so easily if we just keep an eye out for that kind of duality. And so when Paul says, but speaking the truth in love may grow up into him in all things, which is the head, even Christ. So do you see how speaking truth of love in our bodies and in our minds, training our minds towards the light of Christ, that we have power in healing, that we have an assisted power? It's a beautiful thing to think about. So we're going to go one more here. So we're asking everyone to be brave in this. Be brave about snapping your fingers. Be brave about voicing your opposition to the negative thought that comes to your mind. And this is especially effective against trauma triggers. It is especially helpful when the visceral response is trying to come into our bodies with those kinds of triggers. But if we are brave about this, these statements are vital in getting control of our mind and speak the new thought using the new filtered truth. How can we lose when we're speaking truth and we're seeking light? The Lord will not fail us in this effort. What we find in this, I've always challenged every group that I've ever worked with in this, that if you will do the 3 days of this concentrated thought work in your mind constantly, in other words, you have to pay attention for 3 days, that you will be assisted in this practice and that the brain will give up its old ways of processing that negative thought and it will train itself to use the new way, the new pathway, and it will do it itself. I remember the time that I recognized that my brain actually caught a negative and addictive thought pattern and did the work for me. And what was amazing is that I knew it. I knew that my brain had done this on its own. And it was such a revelatory moment. And my husband was next to me, and I said, my brain did it. My brain did it itself. And he giggled and he says, because he used it in his PTS challenges and PTSD challenges. And so be brave and work this. And if you're really into concentrating on this, do it for 3 days and see what the Lord does with your brain. See how much healing actually happens. And we are being assisted by the glory power of the gods in this. I know it. Our magnificence is unveiled to our cognitive or our thinking mind in the whole process, and it strengthens our connection to each other and to our Savior in this new thinking process and faith effort. It's glorious. I hope that you will join us in these things and find joy and magnificence in it yourself. So replay this until it becomes second nature to you, and you will be blessed, and you can teach it to your children. I have women all the time who tell me they teach it to their teenage kids who are struggling in this world today, and they are getting great response. You can, I actually even wrote a little child's book called You Can Be the Boss of Your Brain, and it's in the process of being edited for publication. So this is useful on every level, and we are the recipient of the glory of God in this kind of work because he wants us to be recovered. He wants us to have joy constantly in our lives because life's going to be hard enough anyway. And so join me next time for our next workshop episode, and have a wonderful day. This is Michelle Noel.